The sand burns hotter than asphalt. The skies, once proud with rain, now hang pale and merciless. And beneath them, a boy drags a jerry can across cracked clay, tracing the outline of a nation's most precious currency, water. But there is none. Just heat. Just silence. Just desperation. Then came the order. Not to drill. Not to pray. But to bury. Millions of gallons of purified, desalinated water hidden beneath the Sahel, wrapped in membrane, guarded by silence. The world called it madness. To the thirsty, it looked like betrayal. But to President Ibrahim Traoré, it was something else entirely: survival. Because in Burkina Faso, a nation with no rivers, no coast, and less than 600 millimeters of rain per year, water is not seasonal, it is political. And sometimes, it is war. So when Traoré gave the order to bury the water, he wasn't surrendering, he was declaring something far bolder. Don't scroll past this. The story of water buried beneath the Sahel could be the most powerful act of African defiance in decades. Stay with us. Subscribe because history is flowing and Africa must own the current. August 2025. The Sahel region, northern Burkina Faso. The air is heavy, the land cracked, and the silence deafening. From Dori to Kaya, the ground splits like old leather, revealing a deeper truth. This land is thirsty. Not metaphorically, physically, critically, existentially. Cattle collapse on dry creek beds, women boil water scraped from rusted gutters, children carry jerry cans across empty plains like soldiers returning from lost battles. In a place where every drop is sacred, one decision changed everything. The command came from Ouagadougou: bury it, all of it. It wasn't oil, it wasn't gold, it was water, purified, desalinated, mineral-balanced water, millions of gallons. Not poured into cups or fed into pipelines, but sealed in treated membranes and sunk deep beneath engineered dunes. To the world it seemed insane, to the thirsty it felt cruel. But to President Ibrahim Traoré, it was neither. It was war, a war of logic against legacy, sovereignty against dependency. Traoré had read the forecasts, seen the numbers, and lived the droughts. Burkina Faso received less than 740 millimeters of rain in 2025, the lowest in a decade. In provinces like Oudalan and Tapoa, rainfall barely reached 500 millimeters, far below survival thresholds. Crops failed, pastures turned to ash. Villages in the corridor between Kaya and Fada Ngurma emptied. Mothers pulled children from school just to fetch water 20 kilometers away. In the capital, Ouagadougou, water treatment plants operated 30% below capacity, while the city's population doubled in 15 years. The math no longer worked. So Traoré changed the equation. He issued Directive 44B, a confidential policy document that redefined national water strategy not as a humanitarian priority, but as a security protocol. Under this directive, the project, Silent Reservoir, was born. Thousands of barrels of desalinated water were buried under layers of treated sand, wrapped in hydrophobic membranes, protected from evaporation, theft, and war. These reservoirs were monitored not by foreign aid agencies, but by AI systems built in Ouagadougou, powered by solar microgrids, invisible to satellites, and immune to sabotage. No UN blueprint. No IMF money, no French contractors, just Burkinabe engineers all under 30 trained in Agra, Addis Ababa, and Dakar. Their mission was guided by one doctrine: water is not charity, it is sovereignty. It was the purest expression of independence in a time of climate dependence. While international observers mocked the decision, calling it reckless, wasteful, and unscientific, Traoré stood firm. He was not seeking applause. He was preparing for collapse. He had a vision few dared to say aloud. In the near future, water will cost more than oil, and the nations that bury water, not money, will be the ones that survive. This wasn't an abstract idea. It was already happening. From Niger to Mali, water scarcity had begun displacing more people than conflict. Between 2018 and 2024, over 1.6 million people had been displaced in Burkina Faso alone. The cause? Not just jihadists or civil unrest, but thirst. And in a nation that once fed itself, Burkina Faso now relied on grain imports from Ghana and Benin, creating a geopolitical weakness Traoré refused to tolerate. He warned his cabinet in 2024, if the rains continue to fail, we risk becoming a permanent humanitarian zone ruled not by government, but by aid trucks. His solution was radical, simple, and deeply African. If the clouds won't bring water, we will bury it until we can make our own. Thus, across the Sahel, concrete pads were laid, trenches dug, membranes rolled out, pumps sealed, and water clean, sweet desalinated disappeared into the sand. Not lost, preserved. Not wasted, protected. Not forgotten, weaponized. Every buried liter became a future insurance policy. Every membrane an act of quiet rebellion. Every reservoir a vote against dependency. This was not charity, it was strategy. Traore called it the invisible reserve. To his advisors, he compared it to how the French protect nuclear fuel or how the Saudis manage oil reserves beneath the Rub al-Khali desert. The only difference? This resource wasn't for sale, it was for survival. And while his critics demanded public access, Traore reminded them of a harder truth. A nation cannot drink itself to death to feel democratic. Access must come with structure. Sovereignty must come before sympathy. By September 2025, more than 100 subterranean hydration bunkers had been built across Bulsa, Yatenga, and the northern Sahel. Each one was designed to last 50 years. Each one monitored in real time. Each one a silent declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer beg for water. And as the heat rises, the rain disappears, and the rivers vanish from maps, the rest of the world starts asking, but when every village is thirsty, why hide salvation under the sand? The turning point didn't come with speeches or summit declarations. It came with a hiss of pressure valves, followed by silence. Beneath the sand, water vanished, swallowed by bunkers. Across the world, screens lit up. News outlets from Brussels to Nairobi ran headlines. Burkina Faso hides millions of liters of clean water, while people thirst. And then came the backlash. In the north, angry villagers gathered at military checkpoints. They had heard whispers that a secret pipeline ran beneath their feet. We fetch muddy sips from 30 kilometers away, while the government buries drinkable water, one woman cried in Fata Ngorma. In the capital, protest signs rose. Water is not uranium, we need it now. Online, opposition parties called it authoritarian madness. But President Ibrahim Traoré did not back down. He called a rare national address, standing under a sweltering Sahel sun, sweat clinging to his uniform. No teleprompters, no applause, just this. You do not burn your future to feed today's fear. You protect it even when it hurts. He didn't deny the crisis. He named it the silent genocide of climate neglect. Behind closed doors, his officials used another term, hydro-exodus, the mass migration of millions, not by war or ideology, but by dust, by heat, by thirst. And still the world watched, baffled. The World Bank released a scathing report, calling the underground reservoirs fiscally irresponsible and non-transparent. The IMF threatened to freeze non-water-related loans. The United Nations called the move ambitious but troubling. Brussels asked for clarification on regional water-sharing implications. France offered technical cooperation, a polite euphemism for intervention. Traoré said no to all of them. Because the real crisis wasn't the buried water. It was the world's expectation that Africans must wait for rain, must rely on aid, must receive technology secondhand. But what if Burkina Faso built its own future and buried it like a seed beneath the sand? That was the moment the narrative changed. Traoré introduced the world to Directive AGXS 1025, an unprecedented declaration. Water is a sovereign resource equal to gold, uranium, or oil. No longer just a utility, now a national asset. Access controlled, use monitored, extraction limited, export forbidden. The West gasped. The Burkina Faso applauded. Under this directive, all water reservoirs, surface or underground, were placed under state protection. Unauthorized drilling became a felony, equivalent to illegal mining. Equipment could be seized. Offenders imprisoned. Fines issued in hundreds of millions of CFA francs. Why? Because in the calculus of survival, Traoré believed mismanaging water was no different than surrendering territory. And he had evidence to back him up. Between 2023 and 2025, satellite data showed a 16% increase in evaporation rates across Burkina Faso. Conventional reservoirs were losing billions of liters to the sky. Foreign-funded megadams sat half full while villagers still walked for hours to fetch a single bucket. So Traore pivoted. He launched the National Water Grid, an invisible network of pipelines, microdams, and sealed reservoirs designed to capture, store, and transport water not to markets, but to survival zones. One component, called the Invisible River, ran from Benora to Kaya, delivering desalinated seawater from the Atlantic across two nations through 1,200 kilometers of subterranean pipe. No IMF logos, no foreign flags, just buried steel and local will. Critics called it paranoia. Traore called it prophecy. He wasn't alone. In July 2025, a coalition of African engineers from India, Algeria, and Ethiopia visited Burkina Faso. They didn't come to supervise, they came to learn. From microcatchments to AI-monitored flow controls, they saw something rare, a landlocked nation building a water infrastructure more sophisticated than many coastal states. And the results were clear. In Koudougou, dry season millet farming returned. In Yatenga, women's cooperatives planted tomatoes in October for the first time in decades. In the refugee zones near Djibo, sealed tanks now ran on solar pumps delivering safe water at regular intervals. In Bulsa, local youth maintained pump stations without foreign contractors. Across the Sahel, defunct wells refilled slowly, not by miracle, but by engineered infiltration from upstream microdams. It wasn't a revolution of bullets, it was a revolution of blueprints. But not everyone was convinced. Inside the donor class, anxiety grew. If Burkina Faso's water strategy worked, what happens to the water market? What happens to World Bank control? To Western influence? To development packages tied to access? And that's when Traore dropped his final card. He announced a new initiative, the Atlantic Artery, two bilateral treaties with Guinea and Côte d'Ivoire, securing permanent access to seawater corridors. For the first time, a landlocked African nation had legal access to the Atlantic, not for trade, but for water. The first desalination plant, built just outside Benora, began delivering 100,000 gallons per day, powered by solar grids, manned by Burkinabe, salt byproducts sold to nearby industries, and every liter accounted for under national water law. And while foreign journalists called it delusional, something else began happening. Children stopped fainting in school. Elders no longer queued for hours at broken taps. Rain returned, but this time, it wasn't from clouds, it was from policy. This was the new Burkina Faso. Not waiting, not begging, not surviving. Building, owning, leading. But what happens when the world realizes Burkina Faso may hold the last clean map of water? The buried water brought more than survival. It brought a shift in the national psyche. Across Burkina Faso, something deeper than aquifers began to stir a reawakening of dignity. It wasn't just about hydration. It was about the right to exist without waiting for rain, or worse, for permission. In the central provinces of Koudougou, Yatenga, and Sanguier, farmers who had long abandoned hope returned to their fields. Corn grew where dust once ruled. Tomatoes ripened in October, a month traditionally dry and unforgiving. The success wasn't anecdotal. The National Water Agency's July 2025 report confirmed. Crop yields in pilot zones had doubled within a single season. Water access had increased by 46% in rural areas. Over 12,000 hectares had been reclaimed through subsurface irrigation. For the women of Yatenga, it was nothing short of revolutionary. In villages like Kayamasi and Guibare, women's cooperatives had begun managing their own microdams and storage units. No foreign consultants, no donor reports. Just local knowledge backed by national policy. These women, many of them once excluded from land rights, were now guardians of reservoirs, trusted with the most strategic resource in the country. Before we waited for aid, one cooperative leader said, now we wait for no one. But the water revolution wasn't without political ripples. Inside the National Assembly, opposition MPs accused the government of centralizing control. They questioned Directive AGXS 1025, which classified all water resources as state-controlled sovereign assets, comparing it to colonial-era expropriations. Their argument, when you remove water from local management, you risk silencing traditional structures. Traoré's response, you cannot defend a village if the river beneath it belongs to a foreign firm. Indeed, part of his drive stemmed from a geopolitical weakness he refused to tolerate any longer. For years, Burkina Faso had been importing grain from Ghana, Benin, and even distant suppliers. Drought had made the nation dependent, and dependency made it fragile. Aid trucks had become symbols of humiliation, not hope. To Ibrahim Traoré, that vulnerability was worse than thirst. And so, water became the centerpiece of national security, not in speeches, but in infrastructure, law, and doctrine. Beyond sealed reservoirs and desalination pipes, a new frontier emerged. Fossil water, ancient aquifers locked deep beneath the northern plateau, untouched for tens of thousands of years, immune to drought but non-renewable. Discovered officially in 2024 and confirmed by a joint survey with Sudanese and Indian geologists, these reserves could supply millions. But Traoré saw not only their potential, but their peril. He issued Decree 2304B, marking fossil aquifers as strategic, non-replenishable assets, placing them in the same legal category as gold or uranium. Access would be capped. Every liter extracted had to be matched by surface water replenishment projects, be it rain catchments, solar distillation units, or vertical infiltration wells. Villages that tapped fossil wells were required by law to build recovery infrastructure, ensuring that life today would not cost life tomorrow. Critics, mostly foreign, called it over-regulation. But inside Burkina Faso, it earned Traoré a quiet respect. He wasn't governing for applause. He was governing for children who may never know rain. He put it plainly during a 2025 press briefing, "Don't spend your ancestors' fortune without leaving a coin for your children." This philosophy touched every level of governance. Education curricula were updated to teach water management as a civic duty. Water access cards, similar to national ID, were introduced to monitor usage in sensitive zones. Hydro agents, local citizens trained in storage and distribution, were deployed across regions. The cultural impact was just as profound. In marketplaces, debates about rainfall gave way to discussions about pipeline integrity and reservoir management. In mosques and churches, water became not only a blessing but a responsibility. In schools, children learned that rivers don't always come from the sky, they can be built beneath your feet. Still, pressure mounted. By mid-2025, several regional governors had requested emergency access to buried water during peak drought. The government complied carefully. Using tiered release systems, it opened limited valves to ensure short-term relief without compromising long-term reserves. Every release was monitored, recorded, and published. Radical transparency for a resource once handled in shadows. And yet, the question persisted in whispers and policy meetings alike. Who controls the valves? If water is centralized, who ensures equity? If it's protected, who ensures access? These were not easy questions, but Traoré welcomed them. He created a public oversight council made up of farmers, women's groups, engineers, and faith leaders to monitor extraction and advise on release protocols. For the first time, Burkina Faso's water governance included not just policymakers, but the people who use the water daily. Still, outside the country, the resistance to this model hardened. Private firms in Europe, accustomed to buying water futures and commodifying scarcity, watched nervously. If Burkina Faso's grassroots water model spread, it could collapse entire market strategies built around scarcity pricing. And that was precisely Traoré's intent. In a press conference in Ouagadougou, he put it starkly, "We are not building a market. We are building independence." The Burkinabe knew the stakes. Their history was filled with drought, displacement, and foreign dependence. But now, they were seeing something new. Goats no longer dying at dry troughs. Crops returning to fields once abandoned. Grandmothers telling stories not of famine but of flow. Schools opening near reservoirs. Women installing solar pumps without waiting for NGOs. This wasn't miracle. It was memory reclaimed. This wasn't charity. It was Africa rising one water valve at a time. If you believe this is the Africa we've waited for, type "We choose water, not permission" in the comments. But can one desert nation hold off the pressure of a thirsty continent? As the Burkina Faso water doctrine unfolded, measured in buried pipes, sealed valves, and solar-powered pumps, the world watched with confusion, admiration, and quiet panic. The United Nations released a cautious briefing, calling the strategy innovative, though not without risks. The World Bank, more direct, labeled it fiscally concerning, noting the long-term maintenance burden and the lack of multinational contractor oversight. The IMF discreetly paused unrelated infrastructure loans, citing strategic misalignment. But what no one said aloud was this: Burkina Faso was changing the rules. Traditionally, water policy in sub-Saharan Africa has followed a familiar script: external funding, imported technology, foreign contractors, conditionalities tied to debt, development, or diplomatic alignment. Traoré's model rejected all of it, and Washington noticed. Although the U.S. government made no official statement, American think tanks and water strategy lobbies began publishing concerned white papers. One, from the Atlantic Institute for Resource Policy, asked bluntly, "If Burkina Faso succeeds, do we lose leverage in West Africa?" Because that was the unspoken fear. Water isn't just a humanitarian concern, it's a geopolitical instrument. And if a landlocked, aid-dependent country could create a closed-loop water sovereignty model, what stopped others? In Brussels, the discomfort was even more visible. Water futures had become a booming financial product across Europe. Hedge funds traded access rights, filtration patents, and desalination bonds like oil contracts. But Traoré's public water doctrine, which banned foreign speculation, privatization, or export, broke that model. One EU diplomat was quoted off record: "We spent decades building climate assistance frameworks. Now Burkina Faso wants to build its own without us." But not all reactions were adversarial. In India and Algeria, engineers with decades of desert water experience began quietly collaborating with Burkina Faso teams. These weren't colonial contracts, they were South-South exchanges, grounded in mutual survival. India's solar desalination sector shared open-source tech. Algerian hydrologists helped train fossil aquifer analysts. Even Ethiopia, still recovering from its own water crises, sent advisors to Ouagadougou. This new axis science without sovereignty loss was a quiet revolution. No PR campaigns, no ribbon cuttings, just engineers in sand, sketching out a future where Africa drinks without begging. And what about America? The truth is nuanced. While U.S. diplomatic circles remained quiet, private sector voices grew louder. Water conglomerates in Texas, California, and New York began lobbying for Burkina Faso access contracts, especially for membrane supply chains and desalination minerals. But Traoré's administration issued a blanket rejection. "We will not outsource our future thirst to shareholders." Still, the bigger shift was cultural, not commercial. In classrooms across Ghana, Tanzania, and Niger, engineering students began studying the Burkina Faso water doctrine. In policy seminars in Dakar, subsurface sovereignty became a case study. And across Pan-African news platforms, one question dominated the conversation. If a landlocked nation with no ocean and no rain can build its own river, what excuse remains for the rest of us? What happens when a nation without a navy controls the most strategic liquid on Earth? Burkina Faso's water revolution did not end with buried reservoirs or desert pipelines. It opened a new chapter in African geopolitics, one where water is no longer an afterthought, but the centerpiece of sovereignty, resilience, and destiny. At the heart of this chapter lies a simple truth. Africa cannot afford to wait for rain. The climate math is brutal. Rainfall is erratic, evaporation is rising, rivers are drying faster than they are replenished, and fossil water, those ancient, untouched aquifers, are a finite inheritance. President Ibrahim Traoré understood this. That's why his government declared fossil reserves as strategic non-replenishable assets, imposing extraction limits, offset clauses, and criminal penalties for unauthorized drilling. To him, every drop from the past must pay rent to the future. But beyond preservation, his vision was also expansion. The Atlantic water corridors, born from treaties with Guinea and Côte d'Ivoire, have set a new precedent in Pan-African diplomacy. Water, once treated as a national burden, is now an international bridge, a shared resource protected by legal cooperation and powered by shared infrastructure. This shift has inspired similar conversations in Mali, Chad, and Niger, where young engineers and policymakers are quietly drafting their own blueprints. Not for charity-funded megadams, but for community-owned microdams, solar aquifers, and water-sharing agreements that don't require Western approval. But for all the progress, a chilling question lingers. What happens when those who profit from scarcity realize that Africa is no longer for sale? Across the continent, private water firms, hedge funds, and foreign contractors are still expanding, buying land near aquifers, patenting filtration systems, and lobbying for public-private partnerships that could reintroduce dependency through the back door. Traore saw this coming. That's why his administration embedded legal clauses to prevent water privatization, even in times of emergency. And that's why the doctrine of water sovereignty must not remain Burkina Faso's alone. If Africa is to rise, truly rise, it must own its water before it owns anything else. That means training more engineers, not just importing equipment, building catchments before stadiums, rewarding sustainability over short-term gain, and most importantly, treating water as a birthright, not a bailout. Because in the decades ahead, conflict will not come from borders, but from rivers. Power will not be measured in armies, but in aquifers. And sovereignty will not be judged by GDP, but by the ability to deliver clean water consistently, fairly, and without apology. In this new paradigm, Burkina Faso is not behind, it is ahead. It has built not just infrastructure, but a template, a living argument against the myth that Africa must wait to be rescued. And that's the call now echoing across the continent. Will Africa defend what cannot be replaced? Or follow the path of nations that sold their future by the barrel? Can Africa rise, not with aid but with action? But can Africa resist selling its water future drop by drop? The sun still scorches the Sahel, the winds still howl across empty plains. But beneath Burkina Faso's cracked earth, something irreversible now flows, a silent revolution made of salt, steel, and sovereignty. This isn't just a story of drought. It's a story of design over despair, of choosing policy when the clouds fail, of building hope not in the sky, but under the sand. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for rain, he didn't wait for applause, he didn't wait for aid. He acted. And in doing so, he changed the narrative not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent. Africa no longer has to be the last to drink. It can be the first to innovate. From invisible rivers to subsurface bunkers, from saltwater pipelines to women-led catchment cooperatives, this is no longer a dream. It's a doctrine. One that declares, Africa's future will not be thirst, it will be choice. And that's what Africa Rising truly means. It means owning your resources before they are taken. It means protecting your people before they're displaced. It means storing water before it becomes a weapon. And it means declaring, with no shame and no hesitation, that sovereignty begins with the right to drink without permission. This is not just Burkina Faso's moment. It is a map for every African nation asking the hardest question of all. What excuse do we have left if the most landlocked, drought-stricken nation in West Africa just built its own river? If this story opened your eyes, don't look away. Like, share, and lift your voice. Subscribe, because the next African miracle will not be televised, it will be engineered. Drop your comment below. Let the world know you're watching. Write, Africa can do it, or simply, New Africa, because the rain may never return. But the will? The will is already here.